Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, ready to take you all on a trip down memory lane in this very special video on this here channel. In 2019 I began to cover fighting game history, with one of the earliest videos I covered being on the history of Street Fighter 3 and why so few people would play it when it first came out. Hell, to be fair, most people were so distracted by more popular franchises, the majority of gamers did not even seem to realise Street Fighter 3 existed. This original video 2 years ago would trigger a lot of die-hard Street Fighter 3 fans, who would complain that my retrospective was unfair, and that it was wrong to focus on a game's popularity at the time, and instead I should have placed heavier emphasis on the game's quality and impact within the fighting game community. In this bumper episode we are going to revisit that original piece that got nearly 200,000 views, to see what you think of my overall assessment today. And then we're going to take a trip down a literal salt mine, where I depthfully broke down many of the angry comments that video got. This was some of the most controversial content I've ever uploaded to the channel that generated a lot of discussion, so let's visit it all over again. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Street Fighter 3's failures and the game's insane cult-like fandom. Yeah! Time and time again on this channel I have mentioned both the gaming and cultural impact of Street Fighter 2, and its overall significance and contributions to the world of gaming. The game, along with its many enhanced reiterations, is now a timeless classic. So with that said, you would make the assumption that its true sequel, Street Fighter 3, would be just as celebrated, right? Well, obviously, as we know, this has never been the case. So in today's video, let us explore why, and then go on to look at the features of the game. Street Fighter 3 New Generation was released as the sequel to Street Fighter 2 in the arcade back in 1996 in Japan. The first iteration of this new Street Fighter game would ditch all of the previous characters with the exception of Ryu and Ken, and will replace most of the roster with a brand new set of fighters. This change in lineup is where the game gets its new generation title from. The main character of this roster is a fighter named Alex, in which the game's loose story is based around. Basically, Alex chose to fight in the third World Warrior tournament in an attempt to get to fight against this new game's last boss, Gil, or Jill, however that's pronounced, who happens to be the president of the Illuminati, of all things. The fighting in this game all takes place in a stunning looking 2D environment. The game looks significantly better than both Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter Alpha due to the game running off of, at the time, the new CP System 3 arcade board, as opposed to the CP System 1 and CP System 2, like with other games from the franchise before. This CD-ROM based hardware aided the elaborate crisper look of the game, which overall made this the best looking game in the franchise yet. Before we talk even more about this unique game, let's begin to talk about why this game is so overlooked in the first place. Firstly, we need to take the time frame into account. This game saw a North American and European release in 1997, a year in which 2D gaming was no longer fashionable, and beautiful games like Street Fighter 3 were seen as primitive over the likes of more popular ugly 3D games, such as Mario 64, Tomb Raider and Crash Bandicoot. Even in the fighting genre itself, Street Fighter had been replaced as the world's #1 fighting franchises by that of the Tekken series, which, due to its polygon graphics and even more newcomer-friendly gameplay style, had overtook Street Fighter in popularity and relevance. At Street Fighter 3's release, Tekken 2 was already out, and Tekken 3 would debut only a few months after. I say at this point in time, Soul Blade was probably more played than the Street Fighter games as well. In regards to the decision to make the game 2D, general producer Noritaka Funamizu explained, "We feel that 3D is not really suitable for head-to-head fighting. And to be frank, Capcom doesn't really have the techniques to display high quality graphics in 3D. So in truth, Capcom simply were not yet capable of making a good 3D Street Fighter. Moving away from the 2D graphics and onto other elements that held back Street Fighter 3's popularity, we need to look to the Street Fighter franchise itself for a moment. A strong case can be made that by 1997, people were simply burnt out by the series. Whilst the game referred to itself as Street Fighter 3, in truth the game was never really the third Street Fighter game. Firstly, Street Fighter 2 itself would constantly be released over and over again, with different upgrades applied each time. As a child, I probably would have happily accepted Super Street Fighter 2 as Street Fighter 3, simply due to the new characters and other enhancements. And that is before we even talk about the Alpha series of games. Street Fighter Alpha really was a completely new Street Fighter game that was only not called Street Fighter 3 in the first place due to the fact that the creators wanted the game to be known as a prequel for some bizarre reason. On top of all of this too, even more excitingly, the Street Fighter roster was playable in games like X-Men vs Street Fighter, where you can fight as both Street Fighter characters and X-Men characters, which is much more exciting as a concept than simply playing as a bunch of no-name characters like Alex, in a game which is very clearly not really the third game in the series to begin with. Street Fighter really is one of those series that comes across chronologically confusing and only even makes any sense at all upon doing research. But moving to one side that the game was in 2D in the 3D era, had an unrecognisable roster and was not really the first Street Fighter game, was this all enough to put consumers off from taking this game home in 1997? Well, to tell you the truth, we will never know, as during the game's prime, the title remained exclusive to the arcades, which is why the majority of us have no memories of playing this game during the actual 90s. In regards to this, during a trade show, Capcom's senior planner Shinji Mikami stated each character is made up from approximately 700 to 1,200 individually drawn frames of animation, with the game running at 60 frames per second. Due to this, it would be impossible to convert Street Fighter 3 to any of the home consoles on the market, which prompted at the time a lot of rumours that the game would see a release on the 3DO M2, the cancelled sequel console to the 3DO, which we have already discussed the history of previously on this channel. In regards to the console porting of this game, allegedly, IGN reported on a witness of a demonstration of the game in development on the Nintendo 64DD. However, the 64DD itself was delayed all the way up until December of 1999, and was such a commercial failure that the majority of releases for the platform were cancelled altogether, which obviously would have included Street Fighter 3 if it was ever intended to be released on the system at all. So, both prospective platforms that were set to potentially see ports of Street Fighter 3 were failed projects. Whilst all of this was going on, a poorly received polygon-based Street Fighter game was released in the arcades and on the Sony PlayStation. However, this game was developed by Akira and simply published by Capcom, rather than being a title that ran off the Capcom System 3 hardware. So whilst this game, Street Fighter EX, was poorly received, Street Fighter 3 on the other hand had received relatively good feedback from the critics. However, like myself analysing the game today, they too were rather stumped as to why the game did not feature 3D polygons, despite that being all the rage at the time. A good example of this comes from Next Generation, who stated that the great mystery is why Capcom called this game Street Fighter 3, instead of leaving that honour for a more powerful and revolutionary 3D title. Gameplay in the Street Fighter series reached the ceiling of 2D possibilities a while ago, and as good as this game admittedly is, besides the stunning graphics, there's little to distinguish it from the 11 games before. GamePro echoed this sentiment by saying, while the graphics are outstanding and the controls are flawless, the game lacks the innovation and series evolution that players expected it to deliver. The game makes you look forward to the next Street Fighter installment, rather than getting you excited about playing this one repeatedly. So, what was the same and what was different when it came to Street Fighter 3? Well, like other Street Fighter games, it was a bloody one-on-one fighter, where you fight against a friend or the computer using various attacks and special moves. New features introduced into the mix include the ability for players to dash and retreat, which was taken straight out of Capcom's Darkstalker franchise. Leap attacks were also added, which are small jumping attacks that can be executed against ducking opponents. A new form of attacks, known as super arts, are introduced in this game, which are basically special moves similar to that of super combos present in Street Fighter Alpha. In regards to this feature, you are prompted to pick one of 3 character-specific super arts to use in your contest prior to start of your fight. Like with super combos in other Street Fighter games, the super arts can only be performed upon filling the gauge through attacking and vary in strength based on how full the gauge is. The biggest introduction to the game in terms of fighting mechanics is the introduction of the ability to parry. Basically, at the moment the opponent attacks, if a player moves the controller down at the right time, the attack can be both blocked then countered consecutively. Even special moves and super arts can be countered in such a manner. In terms of the game's fighting roster, the first Street Fighter 3 game features 12 playable characters, which include Ken and Ryu from the classic games as mentioned earlier. In terms of the new characters for me, the apparent star of the game, Alex, is unappealing, boring and generic. Considering this game is the new generation, if I was to compare Alex to anybody, I'd like to think of him as the Lex Luger of the Street Fighter world. A heavily roided marketing mistake who probably could not even body slam E Honda, let alone Yokozuna. The real star of this game is Dudley, who is as memorable a fighter as any from the Street Fighter franchise. This charming British boxer has a fantastic sense of style, and his unique character design earned him a memorable place in Street Fighter's future games. Who doesn't love or know of Dudley, even though he debuted in this overlooked game? Rather than making it to a home console, next for the game it would see an arcade update known as Street Fighter 3 Second Impact, which would include a few more characters, including the return of Akuma as a secret character and Hugo from the Final Fight series. After all, who needs Lex Luger when you can have bloody Andre the Giant instead? Yeah. 1999 would see a second arcade update for the game in the form of Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, which included even more new characters and the addition of Chun-Li, one of Street Fighter 2's most popular characters. All in all, bringing the roster up to 20 characters in total. To further separate this from other iterations, every single character had a brand new stage to fight on as well. The game would not end up on a console until December of 1999, which would mean it would take 3 years for the game to be ported over from the arcade to a console. The game would arrive on the Sega Dreamcast, a platform that was much more powerful than any home console hardware that existed upon the original game's arcade release. The game would come as part of a compilation, along with the first upgrade of the game known as Second Impact. This compilation pack would be released as Double Impact, and as expected with the Dreamcast, it handled absolutely fantastically. As a result, it would not be long at all before the final upgrade, Third Strike, also made its way over to the Sega platform. Despite seeing a console release, I can never really recall the game receiving much fanfare. I guess by 1999, Street Fighter 2's popularity was over half a decade ago, and by that point, Street Fighter 2 was simply considered old, rather than retro, so was yet to receive its full-on legend-like status the franchise is now treated with today. I would go as far to say as that by 1999, the world was even more entrenched and immersed in polygon gaming than it was in 1996 and 1997. So all in all, not many people cared about Street Fighter during this time frame. In terms of fighters on the Dreamcast, bearing in mind if he was even in the minority and actually had a Dreamcast, the apple of your eye in this genre was more than likely to be Soul Calibur. A game that did a much better job of appealing to the graphical style and gaming tastes of the time. To summarise, while Street Fighter 3 was never really particularly relevant during its release cycles, it has to be said that the game's graphical style is in today's world one of the game's greatest strengths. A good looking, well made 2D game like Street Fighter 3 is timeless to both play and look at, which certainly cannot be said for many of the 3D polygon based games of that time. For this reason, in some ways I would say that Street Fighter 3 is the ugly duckling of the gaming world, a title at the time that was often looked down on for its 2D art style that has flourished into a beautiful swan. It outshines the majority of its 3D contemporaries that were born over the same time frame. Street Fighter 3 is just an overall ruddy well made game that was not even given a chance to shine on consoles during its release, due to the fact that they were actually too primitive to even be able to handle a game like this. It would take the power of a Dreamcast a few years later to even give consumers the possibility of taking this fantastic game home. It really is a beautiful game and a technical pinnacle in terms of high quality 2D games of the 90s. So, while Street Fighter 3 was mostly ignored during the previous century, I think it is about time we all start changing that and begin to give this title the downright respect it deserves. Yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of Street Fighter 3, one of the most overlooked games ever made. If you enjoyed this video, then I would greatly appreciate it if you could like, comment and subscribe to receive multiple videos on obscure gaming history straight to your phone or multimedia device. I look forward to hearing from every single one of you in the comment section down below. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here. A few months ago on this channel I uploaded a little video covering the history of Street Fighter 3 and its iterations that were released throughout the 90s. Overall the video was a smash hit, gaining me 130,000 views, over 1.4 million watch minutes accumulated, with over a 93% like to dislike ratio. The vast majority of people seem to really enjoy and appreciate my breakdown and analysis of this title, and my conclusions with regards to why this game ended up so overlooked. I made it explicitly clear that I thought it was a very good game that only failed to reach a large audience during the 90s through circumstances and trends of the period that would lead to the game being largely unnoticed by most throughout that decade. Despite the video being a hugely popular upload on my channel, there was still a very vocal minority who decided to take issues with my historical findings, research and anecdotal evidence regarding the game. In fact, it seems that some people love this game so much that they simply refuse to accept facts that the game was not as popular as others upon the game's 90s release cycle. We have a lot to discuss about all of this today, and equally as importantly, the winds of change that would later blow that would change public opinion somewhat on this title. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Street Fighter 3's growth and its toxic fandom. Ugh. If you have been watching my content recently, you will be aware that I am currently on a journey across Romania. I felt that the perfect location to shoot some of this video would be right here at Selina Turda Salt Mine, the perfect backdrop to discuss this story from, considering I am about to mine all of the salt from my comment section of one of my infamous uploads. Sadly, the comments filled with the most hate directed towards me were held, reported and sent to YouTube, as these users violated the website's policy and terms of service. Ugh. So good due diligence forced me to report these people to keep my comments clean and my account in good order. However, there were still a number of recurring themes that are worth discussing one by one in today's video, as the comments should be rather fun to debunk. The original video itself was titled The Mad History of Street Fighter 3 and Why We Never Played It. The title of this video itself is one of the many elements of my upload that would instantly trigger many viewers. Essentially, many people who are watching the content at home, or even simply seeing the thumbnail in their suggestions, appeared to be so egocentric that they made the automatic assumption that the "we" in my title was referring to them directly. I mean, seriously, what sort of assumptive twat would automatically assume at every single video on YouTube that has the words "we" in the title is referring to them directly? This is the sort of idiocy I deal with sometimes, ladies and gentlemen. Commenters who literally believe the world revolves around them. I made it abundantly clear in the content that we was referring to myself and the average consumer throughout the time frame of the 1990s. So one would automatically assume a portion of these incredibly stupid comments came directly from people who did not even watch the video in the first place. Another layer of ridiculousness that I put up with from this video, that I still put up with every single Street Fighter related upload to this day, relates to my pronunciation of the name Ryu, which frankly I find beyond ridiculous and pathetically pedantic. If you have any knowledge of the world whatsoever, you will be fully aware that pronunciation varies from one person to the next. Here in the United Kingdom, accents and pronunciation change from town to town, let alone from country to country, so to expect me to pronounce the word the same way as someone from Japan is very silly and presumptive indeed. For me personally, my pronunciation of the name Ryu originates from when I used to play Street Fighter 2 on my Super Nintendo as a small child. At that point in time, the only way you could formulate a pronunciation for the name was by bloody reading the text. The fact that Ryu is spelt a lot like Ryan meant I could use my knowledge of phonics to lead me to the conclusion with regards to how I chose to pronounce the character's name. It was very logical, and it would only be a matter of time before my pronunciation was reinforced by the majority of the cast of the Street Fighter movie, who pronounced Ryu's name in exactly the same way I did. The only person who pronounced it differently in the film was M. Bison, who was a villain, so was clearly pronouncing the character's name wrong simply to troll the audience. Obviously, future games released in the West would begin to see the character's name pronounced as Ryu, but being old school and playing the game way before that point, I am forever sticking with the old school Ryu pronunciation, just like the high budget movie wanted me to. To make one final point about this ridiculous nitpick people have with the way I speak, if you say Ryu, you are not pronouncing the name the same way as the Japanese either, and as a result your pronunciation holds the same amount of gravitas as my own. I believe the Japanese pronounce the name with the R and the Y acting as one syllable, in a way my British mouth cannot quite emulate at this stage. So to conclude regarding this point, I doubt as a foreigner anyone from Japan would have any issue with the way I pronounce a stupid name. It is the sort of thing only idiots from a stupid toxic fandom would find any issues with. I wonder if in Japan if they have the equivalent of weebs, who are Japanese but obsessed with Western culture and have issues with locals referring to McDonald's as Makudonoradu. Trying to tell someone else how they should be pronouncing the name of a fictional character from another country is even more stupid than that in my opinion. So from the title of the video to the pronunciations of words, there are a lot of people who like unnecessarily splitting hairs in YouTube comment sections. However, is this a trait that is exclusive to the Street Fighter 3 fandom? Personally, in this instance, I do not think so. Both of these traits are pretty standard of YouTube comment sections across the whole platform. So let us see what else seemed to annoy people about this particular upload. One of my points regarding why most people never played the game on its release was because Street Fighter 3 remained an arcade exclusive for many years. By the late 90s, console gaming was far more popular than the arcades, which was further aided by the success of the Sony PlayStation. Years prior to the game's release, Street Fighter 2 is credited for providing somewhat of a renaissance for the arcade industry, years past the industry's prime. The game would provide a sort of Indian summer for arcades, and due to this, the game would go down in history for temporarily invigorating a huge market. Street Fighter 3 years later did not go on to achieve the same feat. Sure, arcades still existed, as they do to this very day. However, they were not as mainstream at that point as they were previously. Further to this, Street Fighter 2 in its heyday was available in the arcades and basically across every home console under the sun. Street Fighter 3 on the other hand was locked to the arcade for quite some time, so only arcade diehards and lucky browsers would get to experience the game at that point. Despite this though, this did not stop a huge number of people commenting on the video informing me that everyone played this game in the arcade, and essentially if you did not, then you must have somehow been living under a rock. Even when the game and its iterations did eventually make it to a home console, they were released as exclusives to the Sega Dreamcast, a platform that only the minority of consumers owned compared to the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64. There were many more gripes with my video from a select few, which I am going to address and debunk throughout this video. There was further layers of salt to mine, beyond the opinion that apparently most gamers were going to the arcade every week in 1997, specifically to play Street Fighter 3. Right. Fortunately, I previously addressed some of these comments on Top Hat Chat, a further channel I'm involved with, when we uploaded a video discussing why Street Fighter 2 is the most important fighting game ever. So I will show you some of the highlights throughout this video, starting from now, to further emphasise what I have been putting up with from some of these people.
So I'm going to read the first comment that I think that we need to look at, and it's from somebody called Psycho Ambassador, and it says, "Lol, you just had to take a jab at Alex, right? Didn't you? You know he's a fan favourite, right? The only ones who say he's unappealing, boring and generic are just Ryu fans who can't admit their favourite Hobo Shoto has always been exactly what they're calling Alex. Protagonists don't need to wear some smelly ass gi and talk constant philosophical bull something that nobody cares about."
Right, let's be fair straight away. Street Fighter 2 sold over 20 million units because it was a groundbreaking, ultra popular game. Street Fighter 3 on the other hand, although a very fun, entertaining game, it was introduced and birthed into a world where Tekken existed, where Soul Blade existed, these 3D games which were captivating audiences all over the world. Street Fighter 3 on the other hand, it was confined to just the arcades, a market that was on its arse, a market that was dying, a market where only the most hardcore elitist scumbags would even dare to set foot at that point in time. So it was confined up until the third iteration of the series, and then when the Dreamcast was about, they released Double Impact, which was 1 and 2 on a disc, and Third Strike as another disc, and in total combined, those multiple versions on the Dreamcast only shifted 80,000 units. So if Street Fighter 3 is really more impactful on gaming history than Street Fighter 2, why did that game sell 80,000 units yet Street Fighter 2 sold over 20 million? I don't understand the point they're trying to raise at all.
Whilst I admit I was hamming it up with that reply, I do not really believe that people who played Street Fighter 3 in the arcades were actual scumbags. There is a lot here to undress from this comment, and my impassioned verbal reply. Let's start by talking about the main thing that the commenter was annoyed about with the previous video, which was my distaste for the original Street Fighter 3 game's roster, which apart from the game's lack of availability would be a further feature that would put gamers off of the game. The first iteration of the game had a small roster with only Ryu and Ken intact from previous Street Fighter games, meaning that many people's favourite characters were missing in action from the title. Many who did know about the game were instantly disappointed by this. As stated in the previous video, the roster selection would make other Street Fighter games released in the same year seem much more appealing as a result. The year the game was released in Japan, 1996, Street Fighter Alpha 2 would come out, mixing fighters old and new in one game. X-Men vs Street Fighter would also see a release, offering the salivating chance to basically play as X-Men fighters in a Street Fighter game. And that is before we talk about Street Fighter EX and the variety of other 3D polygon based fighters that overshadowed the Street Fighter 3 game at the time. Throughout the game receiving its upgrades such as Second Impact and Third Strike, the other Capcom series would continue to receive upgrades too. There would be another Alpha game, more EX games and more Capcom vs games. Capcom were competing with themselves, and in most cases Street Fighter 3 was the game that tantalised consumers' taste buds the least, which was mainly due to the game's roster in my opinion. In regards to this roster, pushing Alex as the face of Street Fighter 3, purely on the basis that he was hugely muscular, patriotic and American, was an out-of-date archetype you would expect to be popular in the 80s rather than the 90s. Yes, I agree Ryu is not the most interesting character ever, but at least with his size and appearance, he reflects the more relatable everyman fighter, whereas Alex is relatable to very few. As I said in the 80s, I could see Alex being a great choice as a mascot, especially when you consider many claimed he is based on Hulk Hogan. But this was the 90s, goddammit, and people were far more aware of steroid abuse than they were 10 years prior. This was a point in time where Hogan was open to the fact that there was more to his success than just milk, prayers and vitamins. The muscle-headed, very American gimmick was dead by that point, as WWF proved in the early 90s when they tried to position Lex Luger at the top of their card. Roid-headed Lex Luger was not popular with the fans, and as a result was superseded by Bret Hart, a Canadian wrestler with much more of an everyman persona. Basically, Bret was more popular than Luger in the 90s for the same reasons Ryu is more popular than Alex. His existence as a poster boy is just shallow to me, as well as many other fans of the Street Fighter series. If Capcom really did want to create a popular fighter, by Third Strike they should have based the character off of Stone Cold Steve Austin, rather than Hogan. He was a bloody relic. So overall, I fully stand by my point that Street Fighter 3's roster, led by the uninspiring dated Alex, contributed to the game's lack of popularity. Personally, I think he could have been saved if they positioned him as a boss character in the later iterations wearing NWO colours, as characters like Hogan by that point were bad guys and the game needed a 90s edge. But I am purely fantasy programming at this point. The next point worth addressing in relation to the comment section is the sheer amount of people who are adamant that the game sold very well, and in the 90s, despite the fact it was a game that was locked down to only the Dreamcast. In fact, from the research I have done, the game only sold 80,000 units, which is an extremely low number for a direct sequel to the most influential fighting game of all time, Street Fighter 2, that shifted over 20 million units. So let's try and work out why this upsets people so much.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of see this argument a few times in the media sphere that is music. You know, a lot of arguably the most influential bands of all time actually didn't sell that many units whilst they were an actual creative entity, if you know what I mean. You have bands like Joy Division and certain other bands that are massively influential but actually really sold comparatively little compared to what was around at the time. And you could even branch out into art and look at people like Van Gogh, for example, who is arguably the most impactful creative force in art for the last like 200-300 years, arguably so. I'm not an expert, but he sold like 3 paintings while he was alive, while he was actually creating output. So there is an argument to be made for something having a larger impact than its sales suggest. But I can only agree with you in the fact that 20 million compared to 80,000, and everyone knows Street Fighter 2. Everybody has played Street Fighter 2. Yeah. There are vast swathes of people that have never encountered.
And do you know what backs up my argument even further? The video I produced on the subject got over 100,000 views. So it got over 20,000 more views than Capcom actually managed to shift copies of the game.
Yeah.
So I got a wider audience for it than Capcom could get.
Yeah.
But with that audience who watched the video, bearing in mind people who watch my channel are already really into retro games, so I've already got a niche fandom. So that 100,000 people are pretty hardcore gamers, and 90% of them had never really played Street Fighter 3, especially in its prime. So 90% of the people who watched it did completely agree with me. It was the 10% who seem to live in this strange, delusional world where history is completely different to what actually unfolded.
According to many, I am in fact the one who lives in this alternative universe, where Street Fighter 3 was not one of the most popular games of the 90s. In fact, I'm going to read you some comments I received now that emphasise this opinion. What parallel universe are you came from? Another Mandela effect? Street Fighter 33 was the most popular fighting game at that time, and it's the reason why tournaments like EVO existed. No arcade had Tekken or Soul Calibur placed in their stores, but they had rows and rows of Street Fighter 33. The 3D fighting genre was a complete failure. The fighting system itself was boring when they only care about their graphics. I was in Canada and I travelled to Japan, Hong Kong constantly. I don't know what Africa village you came from. Have you heard of King of Fighters? Tekken was never close to become the most popular game ever. Really, check your fact before publish. With regards to this crazy comment, I'm pretty sure I stated that Tekken was the most popular fighting game of the time, rather than of all time. I mean, how could it have possibly not have been the most popular fighter? The game was literally everywhere. The title's presence were huge in the late 90s and one of the key franchises on the Sony PlayStation. The most popular game console that the world had ever seen at the time, in total selling over 100 million units. So with that said, let's respond to another one. I'm only 4 minutes in and I'm hearing fairy tales. Tekken never took over Street Fighter back then. Lol. It became popular and was probably hypest around Tekken 3 and Tekken Tag Tournament, and the game was made for pad play, which was essentially for the kids. It never overcame Street Fighter in popularity in the arcades or in events. Now is the only time Tekken has enjoyed popularity over Street Fighter, and rightfully so. You are absolutely and completely incorrect if you think Tekken ever overcame Street Fighter in relevance. It never happened until Street Fighter V, when all the truly competitive elements were removed from the series. In response to this point, in the late 90s, Street Fighter 2 was still remembered as a hugely influential fighter, and other Street Fighter games also had their audiences, but Tekken was certainly the fan favourite of the period when it came to fighting games. The game, with its for its time beautiful polygon graphics and simplistic gameplay that literally anyone could pick up, made the title a winner. Street Fighter 3 on the other hand was only beloved by a small hardcore niche. There are a lot of salty comments of this ilk, as there are a lot of Street Fighter 3 failure deniers out there when it comes to the game's popularity in the 90s. But enough about this point, let's dig deeper, or mine for salt, I suppose.
Here we go. So this comment here is from Fidel Solis. It says, I played it. British didn't, because they suck, you old Brit. I feel Street Fighter 3 or Street Fighter 2s were the best fighting game out there. Template to others. So
that wasn't grammatical.
It wasn't. But I think that what we need to take out there is that he's putting Street Fighter 3 on par with all of the Street Fighter 2 entries. That's what I got from that.
I think you can make a strong case for the game itself if we're talking about playing it being a very good game, which is even arguably better. However, in terms of significance, Street Fighter 2 is culturally iconic. Street Fighter 3 isn't, and it never will be. Another thing we've not actually mentioned in this chat, which is what a lot of people were up in arms
Go on.
about, was the fact that according to many, Street Fighter 3 was the game that essentially solidified the competitive fighting scene, like tournaments.
Okay.
Like people actually attending tournaments.
Yeah.
It was Street Fighter 3. But that happened in 2004, I believe, which would have been 7.5 years after the game's release.
Yeah, which does give it some kind of credibility
But
as far
it
as
does-
longevity.
Yeah, but it doesn't feed into my narrative whatsoever. But my whole video was about why people didn't play it on release. So the whole thing is completely irrelevant to what I was discussing.
So this brings us on to the next important point to discuss in this video, the bloody fighting game community and its tournaments. For me, this was not a subject that was that relevant to the context of the video I uploaded, on the basis that the competitive fighting game community who attend tournaments, although very intense and very passionate, make up a really tiny niche of the audience whom play and experience these fighting games. Whilst in the grand scheme of things, these tournaments are popular today, but still relatively unknown to the average gamer. Taking a step back to 1996 though, this concept was even more niche. Wikipedia, the god of information, describes the fighting game community as a collective of video gamers who play fighting games such as Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Tekken, Marvel vs. Capcom and Soul Calibur. The fighting game community started out small in the late 90s and throughout the 2000s referred to as the grassroots era, but it has grown to a larger scale in the 2010s, with many tournaments being held across the world. This is predominantly due to the rise of esports and digitised viewing habits on live streaming sites such as twitch.tv. I don't know about you at home, but I'm pretty sure that twitch.tv was never a thing in the 1990s, and no way were esports relevant in popular culture by that point either. If the 2000s were apparently the grassroots era for the fighting game community, then the 90s were the bloody Stone Age. So no matter how popular Street Fighter 3 may have been within the fighting game community in that decade, it would not have affected the game's overall mass popularity, as it was such a tiny niche of society. In fact, the first instance I can even find of Street Fighter 3 being playable at a major tournament, a term I use extremely loosely, did not occur until the year 2000, an event known as B4 Championships, that by 2002 would be renamed the Evolution Championship Series. So with Street Fighter 3's fighting game community popularity being not really relevant to my video on the game's original failings, let us see what people had to say in my comments about this. What the F are you even talking about with Street Fighter 3 being overlooked? Do you follow the FGC at all? You never cite sources for the game not being well received and not having a good community around it. You're wrong. Okay, Mikhail. I am pretty sure I have explained in great detail as to why the game was overlooked in the 90s. I'm not really quite sure how I could have been any clearer. And no, I do not follow the fighting game community, nor did I even know they even existed until the last few years. However, I am looking to do more research into them now that my channel has weekly fighting game historical content. It's only fair. In regards to citing sources on how games were received, I have cited my sources every single week with this content. I even showcase a large range of quotes from different gaming publications from when each title I have covered was released. I hope that explains what the F I am talking about. Anyway, on to the next comment from Tetcom, who states, I can tell you like Street Fighter, but you aren't a rabid diehard fan. Let me then tell you the Street Fighter community considers Street Fighter 3 to be one of the greatest games ever made, and among fighting game fans it's very popular. Maybe to the mainstream audience Tekken 3 seemed more alluring at the time, but Tekken 3 couldn't hold Street Fighter 3's jockstrap in terms of accessibility and playability. Street Fighter 3 is technically superior, and please understand, 2D is the superior choice for a head-to-head fighting experience. It's faster and more accurate, which is why to this day, 2019, Samurai Showdown, King of Fighters and Street Fighter all still 2D experiences. Just want to clear it all up. To be honest, I cannot say I disagree with anything from your comment. However, what I will re-emphasise is in my video, it was about Street Fighter 3's impact on the 90s, and as covered earlier, a few diehards was not enough to impact wider gaming culture at that time. However, that does not mean that the game did not gain traction and a small level of popularity later down the line, which we are going to get into now.
things build up cult followings over time.
Yeah.
I mean,
Earthbound.
there are some terrible games as well that came out and they were terrible, but they've got a cult following.
Yeah,
now.
like plumbers don't wear ties should not have a following, but
No, it
everyone's heard of it.
But that's the thing. So yeah, you can build up cult followings over time. It doesn't necessarily make the game good or better than any other game.
Look at me, I've built up a cult following over time.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. When you started, you were terrible. Yeah. Who's next? Is it you, Orb? I think there's one for you.
I have one from Luciano Cabezas, who says, why we didn't play it? More like why you didn't play it. Street Fighter 3 is regarded as the best Street Fighter game of the series by many, and many people played and enjoyed the game and did it for many years and still do it to this day.
Well, that's what I was talking about earlier in the video.
Yeah.
When I was talking about the egotistical manner of people inferring we as them. Like,
Yes.
Did you ever click on YouTube videos and if it's got we in the title, you assume it's referring to you?
No.
No, it's very strange, isn't it? It seems like a very black and white take to have on the matter.
Yeah, it is a bit strange. Again, it's just cult followings over time, isn't it? People do still play it today, but then again, people play a lot of stuff today. They're called retro gaming enthusiasts.
Yeah, there's enthusiasts for the game. There's no doubting that, but it's a very tiny market segment.
Yeah.
Well, it says about 80,000. What's that? 5% of the original people who would have played Street Fighter?
I can't be bothered to do
No,
that.
it's not 5%.
It's nowhere near 5.
Not even 5%, is it?
Speaking of cult followings over time, like games such as Earthbound, Street Fighter 3 is one of those games that has become a lot more popular as time has gone on. Particularly the third edition known as Third Strike, with it being the most polished game in the series. I feel this probably happened due to a multitude of reasons. The first and most obvious of these would be the fact that past the Dreamcast, the game would go on to see releases on a variety of other systems years after its initial run. Over the years, this would include the PS2, PS3, PS4, Xbox, Xbox 360, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch and PC. Technology has finally managed to catch up with this game, and as a result, Capcom would put the game at every opportunity they've had. As time has progressed, online play for this game has slowly become more and more accessible, and it's appeared on more hardware as a result. The ways we're exposed to games has also changed massively since the 90s, with platforms such as YouTube rising up, giving this game a bigger spotlight than it had received previously. It would not be until 2008 that Street Fighter 4 would see a release in the arcades, all in all giving this game 12 years of breathing space before a successor would arrive. This would lead to some who were bored of Street Fighter when the game originally came out to end up trying it out on newer hardware down the line. This was one of those games where, as word of mouth spread, it slowly became more popular as time went on. Sure, it was not a commercial success when the game first hit the scene, but it slowly built an audience as time progressed and moved on. However, there is one more point worth discussing that you could argue a case for adding to this game's late popularity, a moment many do not forget, which a lot of people felt the need to mention in my comment section, including T-Core, right here, who states, didn't mention the Evo moment, trollless and false title for video, talks crap because it plays like a Street Fighter game. To say it's the same is stupid. It adds the ability to party any move and the EX attacks which even Mortal Kombat uses now. Also having to choose a super was unique too. Saying it sucks because it plays like it should, yet troll it because of a fresh cast of characters. Top hat troll. In regards to this redunculous comment, I felt no need to mention Evo, as the tournament had barely gained traction in the 90s, so had absolutely no effect on Street Fighter 3's lack of popularity over that period. However, that does not stop Decor and many others from accusing me of trolling. However, with today's video addressing the next chapter in Street Fighter 3's history, the Evo moment this person speaks of is finally relevant to this content. As time progressed, the fighting game tournaments would begin to increase in size, and by 2004 an incident would occur at an EVO event that would spotlight these fighting game tournaments in a more visible position than ever before, and this incident involved Street Fighter 3. EVO 2004 was the birthplace of something known as EVO Moment 37. During the Street Fighter 3 Third Strike tournament, Diego Umihara, playing as Ken, while facing Justin Wong using Chun-Li, successfully parried one of Chun-Li's super moves while having very little health left, and then countered with his own, winning the match. This highlight became highly influential within the fighting game community, and the original video of this moment, uploaded 13 years ago, has now had a whopping 8.6 million views in total. To put those numbers into perspective, that is more views on one single video than all of the videos I've ever uploaded put together. Also, as mentioned earlier, as we move through time, the fighting game community grows from strength to strength, which is massively assisted through easily accessible live broadcasting of esports through websites such as twitch.tv, and the Street Fighter 3 EVO Moment 37 was one of the catalysts amongst these events. So all in all, Street Fighter 3 is certainly a lot more popular than it was in the 90s, which has occurred due to the game's steady growth over time. It appears that many fans of the series do not seem to realise that the game had such a rocky start to life. So does Street Fighter 3 have a toxic fandom? Well, from what you have seen from today's video, the community surrounding the game certainly has an elitist element to it, full of delusional deniers of the game's original failings. However, if a game has a community this vocal and passionate, and even one that is at times misled and abusive, at least it proves the creators of Street Fighter 3 must have gotten a lot of things right. With that said, we are going to highlight one more comment, as it was possibly our favourite from scrolling through the over 1300 comments posted on this video. So here it is. Enjoy!
Is there another one? I'm just going to check. There we go. Okay. This I think this is the last one that we'll do.
Okay.
Okay. It says.
Can I read it?
Yes, you can. It's from Joan Xing.
Joan Xing says, "It wasn't overlooked. You're just a casual who never really played fighting games and is only reviewing it because you have an insipid, underwhelming and completely unoriginal YouTube gaming review channel. You are a serious idiot if you've never heard of this game and probably only review video games in a pathetic attempt to cash in on a market that is already oversaturated with channels infinitely more better than yours and with much better insight and people who actually know what they're talking about. So fudging annoying to see no-name, melanin-challenged, beta British losers put their asinine stamp on something, attempting to be incisive while actually looking ignorant. AF. You would like to state, love your choice of verbiage and your vocabulary is excellent. However, your sentence structure leaves a lot to be desired, Sir Joan Xing. Just saying."
Has he got commas fronted adverbials?
Some
Modal
but
verbs?
Some of the sentences ran on. You could use a semicolon, man. Use a semicolon.
Right. So there was a lot of points there. I mean, the one that I really want to tackle is the fact that you were called Melanin Challenged.
I'm not melanin challenged at all. You saw my tan a few weeks ago.
Yeah. No, that's not the one I want to tackle. It's the sheer outrage. I mean, I read that exactly the same way that Orb read it. And I think that was his intent. How can you be that angry about loving a game that is not as good as Street Fighter 2?
But no, that's the thing. I put in the video, I did nothing but praise Street Fighter 3. All I did was state facts that nobody played the bloody game.
Yeah.
Which is factual.
Yes, it is.
It's completely factual.
I mean, there's loads of games that I like that aren't as good as Street Fighter 2. I like a lot of Tekken games. I like a lot of Soul Calibur games.
But the argument then wasn't, is it better than Street Fighter 2? The whole argument was, there wasn't an argument, it was why we didn't play Street Fighter 3 as in the mass market, which I stated multiple times. Despite the fact that I'm middling challenged.
I would like to say that was by far the most eloquent comment.
It was.
And I enjoyed reading it and performing it. Joe Shinding, if that's your name, can you please send in more comments like that, I will happily read them out. So.
Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of Street Fighter 3's growth and its toxic fandom. I hope you had as much fun watching this video as I did making it. It was great fun down here in the salt mine, creating this rebuttal to all the points that triggered members of this video's audience. If you enjoyed today's video, I release new fighting game content every Thursday on this channel, so make sure you like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to be informed of when I upload new content. Make sure you leave your thoughts on what you've thought of today's content down below. If you want more fun YouTube content on my wrestling channel known as Top Hat Wrestling Man, I have a new video covering the man who fell in love with the mop. And on my wife's channel, Lady Decade, she has uploaded an in-depth video covering the history of the official Indian variant of the NES. So bearing in mind that quite a few of you have asked me recently to upload some new content on console hardware history, I would imagine you would enjoy her unique video, so be sure to check both of these out. Finally, huge thank yous go to my Patreon backers who provide me with additional funding that helps the day-to-day running of this channel, including being able to create content on obtuse subjects such as Game Gear games that are not likely to get great views. So thank you for all of your support throughout this tough pandemic. In regards to patrons, shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Heyo, Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey R. Marcini, Capcom vs SNK, BXL Gotham, Ryan Dinch, Evan Balder, Philip Manth, Azure Rorakai, Keith Ferguson, Joaquin Varela, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Angel Light 85, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of Ted, Gary Pinkett, EC Professor, Kid Anime, Justin Wang, Aaron McNamara, Hermes Gonzalez, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Michael Hall, Wesley Sanghi, Fellatio, Langston Miller, Noob, Brian Barry, Sarah Powell, Blamick Renee, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, TOG Driver, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Richard Stu Stewart, Dan Van Damme, Lewis Fion, John Bates, David Bauer, Chris Fisk, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Retroverse.com, Casey Wright, Since Days is Zai, Andrew Bazansky, Alex Summers, Gunther Hendricks, and everybody else who supports my work. Thank you all so much. Cheerio.